Say you feel totally healthy, you wake up, you're having a great day, you're walking around, the sun's shining, it's nice and cool out. And then all of a sudden you open a door and you get a splinter or a paper cut. You look down, you see that your hand is bleeding. That's when you realize you're human. We look at Nietzsche and he says, God is dead. There is no meaning to life. All is in vain. Okay, so we can see that that has some truth to it, but it's not the entire truth. It is his perspective on the truth based on his upbringing, his life, because he had quite a bit of suffering in his life as well. There's meaning in everything, but there's less meaning in some things than other things. There was suffering, such great suffering, that the meaning became the next breath. And this is something that Solomon talked about, how you can bear the suffering in the best way to profit yourself. Give up your longing for material things. Give up your longing for pleasure and partying and whatever it may be that you enjoy in life. You must accept that that can be removed at any time. And once you accept that it can all end within a second, you then live as though every single day is a miracle, because every single day truly is a miracle that you're alive on the earth. Because even if you are suffering, you are still being triumphant as a human. You are still surviving. Suffering can bring out the best in people.
Most people start from scratch dealing with suffering, don't they? Hello, everyone. Today we have, as usual, a very interesting guest. He's particularly inspiring for me because when I started a bit more than a year ago in taking interest in philosophy, he was one of the first persons I've met with similar interests and who I have a huge depth of gratitude because he also inspired me to keep going on. And he is a part, without a doubt, of my journey. So at just 17, Colin is what one would call an ancient soul. He's a very well-read gentleman, knowledgeable of many profound thinkers' works, such as Enlightenment and modern philosophers. Colin has written many essays and books and has been included at Barnes and Noble. His book, Time Eternal, a compilation of philosophical, poetic, and atmospheric works, hit the best-selling list twice, charting on 2 different philosophy categories on Amazon. And Colin has also created the publication called Philosophical Rambler to spread his love for philosophical ideas and tradition. He's also active on Twitter, where you can most easily reach him. Then you can find the link to Colin's Twitter on the video description. So what brings us today is Colin wanted to discuss a very specific topic. Would you mind saying a few words, if you want to complement words about where you're at right now, and then also introduce the topic? Feel free, Colin.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast, first off, Rogerio. I really appreciate it. And I believe today we're going to be talking about the meaning of suffering, if there's a meaning to it, if there could be found beauty in suffering, and sort of all the area around the topic of suffering, because there's quite a bit to cover on that. You could spend a lifetime, and many have, talking about the subject, but it's something I particularly have studied quite a lot and find very valuable. And I know you do as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, of course, anyone who has lived at least until teens or adulthood has probably lived enough life to at least realize what suffering is about, to at least have a sampling of suffering. Many people, much before reaching adulthood, experience breakups, having relationships that they really cherish, whether friendships or romantic relationships, those first experiences with dating, that sometimes these relationships go really well, but I think most of the times they really don't continue. It's a normal process of people trying to experience things for the first time, trying to experience specific relationships for the first time. And there, of course, there's always the ever-present possibility of loss and grief. So loss could be just physical stuff that we are attached to. Some people are way more attached to stuff than others, and every single person can experience grief because we are all humans, we are all mortal humans. Uh, we are never absolutely sure if we will live a long, plentiful life, or if our life will be shortened, or of anyone else around us who we love. And so all these possibilities of suffering exist. Possibly there are more than I've enumerated here, but well, if you would like to also chime in, because while I am 38 years old, you are a little bit younger. So my perspective on the early adulthood phase is kind of fading away. I'm just seeing things on a third person perspective right now at that
Mhm.
phase of life, and you have much more vivid recollections of experiences in that phase of life.
Yeah, certainly. So I think as people first begin to experience life, they have a very ideal view of what life is supposed to be. Growing up, most people are protected in a sense. They're made to show that the world is a good place, that people are fair, that they'll be treated fairly, that they will not experience intense suffering, that people are not going to simply die before their eyes. That's not something that happens in the modern world. And that's something that I think is some would argue that that's something that's missing. And so a lot of people in the American homestead movement, for example, who wish to return more to nature and tradition and their values of the past, they tried to focus more on emphasis of death. And some would argue that that is not a good thing to do. But I would say that it is needed because if you don't have enough mortality in your life or in society, you think that you're just going to continue on forever. You're not going to live meaningfully. And obviously, as philosophers, we need to live the most meaningful life that we can.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And when we are talking about intense emotions like suffering, and it assumes many forms, um, of course, being it intense, it surely has some meaning. Only if we don't examine our suffering enough can we jump to the conclusion that the suffering doesn't have any meaning. Were many thinkers in the past that talked a lot about suffering and how to deal with it. Some even went beyond surpassing suffering. Some even talked about how to look at suffering as a resource to drive yourself to become better, to be a little more impervious to the worst effects of suffering. Some people might become catatonic or paralyzed or traumatized in such a way that they become in some way incapacitated. But if people learn to become more acquainted and more comfortable with the idea of suffering and with when suffering really happens, they might build a more resilient and perhaps even anti-fragile mind.
Definitely. And I think if people are going to wake up from their 9 to 5 grind of life and really understand why they have this suffering. Like you said, examining why they have the suffering, what the cause of it is, and how they could possibly fix it. Until that point, we will continue to go in the way that we are as a society and the world is in general. And I use the phrase society in a sense of global culture because global culture is society. It's all one now because of the internet and how interconnected everything is. Like we're talking together right now across the world, across two different continents. Previously, even 30 years ago, that's not something that would have been happening this commonly. And so now that we have a global society and it's moving forward in a state of quote unquote progress, we see that mortality is, I guess you could say, left behind. Because as people become more materialistic, they become less focused on death. We push death away into funeral homes, we push it into senior care centers. When someone dies, it is a moment, it's a momentary event. It's not something that reverberates throughout the community anymore. Of course, a death will hurt the family, people will notice it, but it's not what it used to be. You don't commonly hear of people passing away. That makes sense.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of like people are trying to live by the idea or the notion that ignorance is bliss, even if
Definitely.
subconsciously. It's kind of like a way in which people are not awake, a way
Mm-hmm.
in which people are kind of anesthetized or numbed to a very real part of the world. It's undeniable, one of the most absolute truths of all the pieces of knowledge I've collected during my studies. The concept that since we are alive, uh, we are mortal, and one day we are going to die, and that is a realization that when we are growing up, we eventually figure it out. And most of the times when we figure it out, we don't have all this philosophical wisdom and notions of meaning. What meaning can we extract from the fact that we are mortal and ephemeral? In the large scale of things, our lifespan is basically nothing. And so it's possible that someone that doesn't have any training to have a resilient mind, they might fall into nihilism, which is the belief that nothing has meaning, which is ludicrous, and we can go into it uh, more, go into why it's ludicrous, or into a lifestyle of unenlightened hedonism. Basically, since their connection with the physical world is through their senses, and they might be reminded of their mortality through their senses, or even through their minds just accessing memories of the notion of death. They subconsciously, perhaps, or by assisted by whatever is hyped in society, in pop culture or whatnot, they might turn to entertain their senses, to overstimulate their senses, so as to maximize sense pleasure without regard to consequences, which can be unsustainable and lead to, in the long run or even medium term, to an unhealthy outcome and suffering in the end. But while people are in this middle phase of indulging their senses, they take advantage of this momentary and short-lived pleasure to not think about these absolute truths that are always there. We are always accompanied by death wherever we go. We only need to stop breathing and stop supplying our brain with oxygen for a few minutes, and we are gone. So we're always, in a sense, attached to our lives by a slim thread.
That reminds me of I forget where I read this, but people do not realize that they're fully human until they get a cut. Say you feel totally healthy, you wake up, you're having a great day, you're walking around, the sun's shining, it's nice and cool out, and then all of a sudden you open a door and you get a splinter or a paper cut. You look down, you see that your hand is bleeding. That's when you realize you're human. Because people can easily forget in the objective sense that they are a creature, they're a human being, because we think of ourselves as us. We look out into the world through our minds, through our eyes, and we see it from our perspective. We I've always thought of it in an interesting way of almost like a Sims character, the Sims game, where people move around the little characters in the house or the game, and you see it in a three-dimensional objective sense. That's the way that people have to be able to view themselves, to see how other people are viewing them, how they're interacting with the world, and even to find what is meaningful. Because as you said, there's meaning in everything, but there's less meaning in some things than other things. And so there's no measure that we can objectively put on how much meaning is in one action or another. We can say relative to us what something means, but to someone else, it may have no meaning whatsoever. And so, an author I particularly read quite a lot of is Dostoevsky. And people have often made fun of him, especially in modern times, as being a very dark figure in his writing. And quite obviously, he is very focused on mortality because of the period in which he lived in Russia. And death was all around him, as it was for many people of the age. But we see in him that death was something that was common, it was something that was accepted, and it was something that was normalized. Because, like I said, nowadays, who is writing about the meaning of suffering? We think about only one person that comes to mind, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson obviously has talked quite a lot about meaning and the bearing of suffering, particularly because Dostoevsky writes on the pain of suffering, but Jordan Peterson has elaborated a bit more on that of how to bear the suffering. And that's something that we have talked about quite a lot, I believe, of how you can bear the suffering in the best way to profit yourself.
Even way before Dostoevsky, um, it was kind of Siddhartha Gautama's specialty to focus on suffering, basically, when he was wandering after he was shielded, like we mentioned before. Many people are shielded from the real world and the nastiest, quote unquote, nastiest parts of life. He was raised up to adulthood without ever seeing anyone ill or of old age or dying, and only by getting out of his abode, his palace, voluntarily getting out of the box to see the real world, did he experience these things. And so a lot of philosophy that was originated or was documented in almost 3000 BC was how to live a good life, and specifically how how to um, realize that a huge part of life is about suffering, how can we not set us for unnecessary suffering? Because, as you mentioned, everything has meaning, and some suffering might have less meaning when we are, for example, attaching ourselves too much to physical stuff. For example, someone might become really attached to their car, and their car might get stolen or crashed, or in some other way damaged beyond repair, and without other possibility of recovering, and they lose the car. So as they were developing this attachment to the car, they were kind of setting themselves for suffering that is much less meaningful than suffering when you lose a loved person. When you have people around you that you love, and if one doesn't take them for granted and forgets that they are mortals like us, they are human beings, they might depart from the physical world when we least expect it, and it might happen in such a way that we are left without closure because we were kind of focusing on other things that arguably are less essential, then enjoying wisely the time we have with the cherished people around us. And so people might find themselves grieving from losing a loved one, which they always will. When we lose a loved one, we will grieve. But the difference between wisely nurturing relationships with people around us, instead of taking them for granted and paying attention to other superficial, non-essential stuff, is that the pain and suffering of grief from a relationship that is terminated with death, it will much more intensely produce grief that is more difficult to rebound from. So I could give an example of Marcus Aurelius, who really wept intensely when he lost his beloved master, Junius Rusticus, or when he lost most of his children to disease. He being a Stoic, contrary to the belief that Stoics don't experience emotions, he did experience emotions, but he had to. He rebounded, and he had to rebound more quickly from his grief-stricken state. Find possibly also through finding meaning in this grief, and then keep going on as a functional human being capable of serving others. And so just to go back to Siddhartha, he would talk about suffering comes from attachments that don't have any meaning. Suffering comes from you not examining your life, from like suffering coming from ignorance. And so possibly these notions about suffering, they migrated through the Silk Road and whatnot, not just from Siddhartha, but possibly from many others. We don't know for sure, but there was probably cross-pollination, and there are similarities between the Stoics and other Western philosophers that emerged a little later, and these Eastern philosophies or traditions. And so, of course, in the wide constellation of the best human thought that we have available, fortunately, wisdom has survived to us that gives us the possibility to deal with challenges in our life, such as suffering, without needing to start from scratch, which is most people start from scratch dealing with suffering, don't they?
Yes, definitely. Most people, when they have suffering, it bewilders them. They go into a state of shock. They don't know how to handle the suffering. And quite frankly, it usually puts them on the decline in life. They might start drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, doing drugs, etc. And they're trying to figure out how to cope with this pain in them that they know has tremendous meaning often, but they don't know how to position that correctly to use it as a fuel for their life. Because as you well know, the primary thing that you need in life is meaning to be able to function every single day. People can say that the world is meaningless, but if someone truly believes that in their waking every hour, they're telling themselves the world is meaningless, they're not going to be able to function. So they can say on a grand scale, okay, the world is meaningless. They can say that as a statement, but they still must go about their daily life. They must go to their job. They must take care of their kids. They must go to a party, and they find enjoyment. They find suffering, sorrow, many different things that come through life. And they can continue to say on the grand scale that that's all meaningless, but they're living as though there is meaning. And so does that become real meaning? What does that become? No one has quite deciphered. Because if we both agreed that the world had no meaning, and yet we continue on with our day, we'd be hypocrites. Because if
Exactly.
the world has no meaning, then there's nothing to do. And that's nihilism. And obviously Nietzsche's talked quite a bit about that, as he was the bringer of death, of God, and the like. And so if we look at Nietzsche's and then we go to, say, Solzhenitsyn, we look at Nietzsche and he says, God is dead. There is no meaning to life. All is in vain. Okay, so we can see that has some truth to it, but it's not the entire truth. It is his perspective on the truth based on his upbringing, his life, because he had quite a bit of suffering in his life as well. And so when you have a lot of suffering in your life, you become more acutely aware of it. And especially if you're a writer or you're a creative person, you output more of that because that's your environment. So then we move from Nietzsche to Solzhenitsyn, and we see in the Gulag Archipelago, I would argue the greatest amount of suffering produced in any book because of the grand scale of how much suffering there was and how meaningless relative to their prior life it was. Because if Nietzsche was to comment on the Gulag Archipelago, what would he say? Obviously, we would never be able to know, but he would say something along the lines of, well, it is the human story. This is just what happens continually throughout history. There is endless pain, there's endless suffering that humans inflict on each other without a meaning in the way that people need to be able to bear that. And so closing up this argument would be there was suffering, such great suffering that the meaning became the next breath. And this is something that Solzhenitsyn talked about was, for example, if a man is hanging off a cliff, he has no care in the world if someone's going to give him $10 million. He doesn't care if he has won the lottery, whatever it may be. All that matters is that he continued to hang on that cliff for one more second. Because if he releases, his life ends, and all that he cherishes ends with it. So meaning can become hyper focused on something that is prior relatively meaningless. We're breathing right now. But if we were to be in the hospital later today and we were to have, say, an ailment of the lungs and we were struggling to breathe, every breath would become extremely meaningful and critical. And so meaning becomes relative when suffering is imposed.
So context is important, and the kind of suffering that is going on, it can drastically change the context.
For sure, definitely.
Since context can change quite a bit in our lives, it probably is unwise to find a way of dealing with life in a fashion of one size fits all. It just won't hold to the context. It might work in more milder contexts when people are breathing and eating and having their basic necessities fulfilled. But when something it shakes that normalcy, people might not be able to rise to the challenge or respond to the level of how the context changed. And so you can typically, and this was caricatured in one of the Batman movies when the Joker was saying that people are only living well ordered in society because things are going well. As soon as things start going wrong, they just start to default to behaving as everyone for themselves. And so
Yeah, definitely.
it kind of gives us a view of a shadow ethic that perhaps pervades the society. So it's a shadow ethic that is it's epidemic in society because people are unphilosophical. Unfortunately, they haven't grabbed something meaningful and that provides meaning regardless of the context. And I think this comes with quite a bit of wisdom. Wisdom would be the ability to figure out on the fly what is essential, regardless of the context.
I think what is essential for different people varies, of course. Like there's some general things that matter to people, such as family or pets, their jobs. But an example I was just thinking of in relation to mortality is I was watching a movie last night, All Quiet on the Western Front. Fantastic movie. I highly recommend watching on Netflix. And it's a movie that's focused on mortality because obviously World War One, the amount of people who died is tremendous, on the Western Front especially. And so in the movie, obviously not giving away any spoilers, there's four young men who join the German army, and their story plays out. But as we see in the movie, people who died after the war was over, it seemed to have more significance than if someone is shot down next to you, the next person shot down, the next person shot down. You just become another person who has been shot down. Whereas if you were back home in, say, civilian life, or you were back home after the war, and that same person had died, say, from a car accident, or they had died from a disease, like a heart attack, for example, it would have become a much bigger event, though it is the same event. So, of course, the context is extremely important.
Yeah, and during history, of course, we have had the examples of war, as you mentioned, and also plague. When I read Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War, they had both. They had a devastating war where people were slaughtering each other. Even outside the battlefield with pillaging of defenseless settlements, people being placed in very extreme circumstances where they do extreme things. And of course, when a lot of people were concentrated in Athens to deal with the invading Spartan armies, the worst thing possible happened. A plague started there, and the plague not only brought the entire city to its knees, with many people dying just randomly. It seemed that everything was meaningless. They also lose their most competent leader, Pericles, at the time. After losing the Athenians losing their wisest leader, their most competent leader, Pericles, they decided to invade Sicily just on the basis that it was supplying their enemy Spartans. So they sent their most of their youth as tens or hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The numbers are difficult to come to precisely, and in hundreds of ships. And so they unnecessarily and foolishly and greedily wanted to take over Sicily, which was a very well had very well established settlements, very well defended, very well guarded, and with a lot of supply chains. And they just went into a situation without any supply chains foolishly. And they were camping in tents, fighting with people that were living, sleeping in cities. And so these people faced suffering unnecessarily in a campaign in a faraway island, huge island, that produced no results. All these thousands of young adults and teenagers, basically, they died or were captured and enslaved and worked in quarries in the blazing sun and elements and whatnot. And so they just went into a foolish situation that was completely unnecessary. And so it just showcases, as an example from history, how with the lack of wisdom, with the lack of thinking about the consequences of our actions, we can inflict on ourselves and our loved ones unnecessary suffering, which is one of the things that is important about pain and suffering. We need it to have meaning, and so if we need it to have meaning, we must at least start by doing the best we can to cut out from our lives unnecessary suffering. And unnecessary suffering usually comes from lack of wisdom. And so it's really important to gain wisdom, to know how to manage ourselves and the people around us, to develop good leadership skills, to play in risky situations wisely, to not put ourselves in risky situations unnecessarily, so as to avoid unnecessary suffering. If at least people do that, and bringing this to the modern world, if people realize that a relationship is really not working and it has abuse in it and whatnot, if they still continue in this meaningless or less meaningful situation of suffering, they are really blocking themselves so as to not flourish. And in contrast to being paralyzed by suffering, human beings must figure out how, regardless of the context, how to figure out how to flourish.
I think that's a very interesting point because suffering can bring out the best in people. mild doses of suffering can bring out the best in people, but also life-changing events. Life-changing circumstances can happen that can bring out the best in people. And we've talked about in the past, beauty can come out of suffering. A lot of beauty can come out of suffering, or no beauty can come out of suffering. And this is something that's highly debated, is going back to Solzhenitsyn. If you look at the Gulag Archipelago, do we say that it is beautiful that he has gotten out of the archipelago at the end? Do we say that it is triumphant for him to overcome the suffering every single day? Do we say that it is meaningless because the work that they were doing was in the end meaningless? Or do we say that it is simply human existence? And so whatever someone personally attaches the meaning to in that, they will never understand what the people actually felt. Because we can try to impose our own meaning on, say, working in the Gulag system or being a slave in ancient times. We can try to impose a worldview of, well, they could have enjoyed this, or maybe one day they had relief from suffering. That's enjoyment, they would say. And so at what point does suffering or relief from suffering become all that life is? And this is something that I've actually written about, is the vanity of trying to escape suffering, because you're going to suffer regardless of who you are. We're all going to suffer in some form. It's something that the ancient philosophers, which you're particularly fond of, talk about, is if you die before you die, then you will not die when you die. And that is something that I have taken quite to heart. And I'll repeat that once more, a bit slower. If you die before you die, then you will not die when you die. And so it's a paradoxical statement, because you have to die to the world. You have to give up your longing for material things, give up your longing for pleasure and partying and whatever it may be that you enjoy in life. You must accept that that can be removed at any time. And once you accept that it can all end within a second, you then live as though every single day is a miracle, because every single day truly is a miracle that you're alive on the earth. Because even if you are suffering, you are still being triumphant as a human. You are still surviving. And survival is something that was talked about a lot during the archipelago system, or the Gulag system, I should say, was the triumph and the meaning was found in surviving day to day. And so this is something that I apply to life, and that Jordan Peterson talks quite a lot about as well, is bearing your suffering, bearing your cross in the biblical sense. Every single person has a unique set of suffering that they have to endure. Some have it objectively harder than others. And so if you are able to position yourself so that you take the suffering that you have metaphorically and put it on your back and then walk up a hill, taking that suffering. So you're facing the suffering, you're going up an incline, and you're able to reach the top of the hill, then you have transcended your suffering. You took your suffering upon you. You had more suffering because you walked up the hill, because you had to process the suffering, and then you transcended it at the top of the hill. And that is how you're able to bear it typically. That's how I've been able to bear suffering in my life. And now I would argue hundreds of thousands of other people have as well.
Yeah, it's a really inspiring way to look at how to process, how to deal with suffering. As you mentioned, objectively, we might say that people have different levels of suffering if we compare between people. But we can also say that some people ended up with stronger ways to deal with suffering, with the same suffering. And so what could be a very devastating disease for a person, for another person, that same disease with the same symptoms, they will just dismiss it as a little stumble in their lives, and they wouldn't give it such a role in their lives. They wouldn't allow that form of suffering to hinder their ability to assign meaning to either the suffering or their lives. And also, they wouldn't let they would never let that suffering to hinder them from expressing virtue in their lives, either courage, charity, justice, etc. And so it's really sobering to see people like an ancient Greek guy that lived 2,800 years ago, for example, called Stilpo, who lost his entire family to war. Some army invaded his settlement and killed everyone, and he was lucky to survive, but he lost his wife and kids. And so the guy that invaded, he was, besides doing all that killing and pillaging and destroying, in the end he even tried to get the best out of him, to get the best over him mentally. So he asked Stilpo, "Have you lost something?" Kind of like attempting to mentally bully him. And since this guy Stilpo, he had studied philosophy, and he had mentally prepared to die and prepared to deal with death and prepared to keep going no matter what, he just replied, all my goods are within me, without a hesitation. And so we picture people enduring for what would be for us life-changing events, without a doubt. They would be, for most people alive, traumatizing, and they would scar them for life. However, these ancient people, if their stories have any basis of truth, they give us an idea that within us as human beings, there is immense potential, and probably immense untapped potential, that we can, by working on gaining self-knowledge about ourselves, figuring out how we are working emotionally, if we are organizing our priorities right, if we are living correctly, or we are misliving, in a sense. So we see such huge contrasts in the ways people deal in the past with similar things, and they deal with things so drastically differently. One person might say, this was traumatizing to me, and I will bear this scar for my entire life, and it will haunt me till the end of my days. While another person who had fortunately had more toughness with wisdom or something like that, it's a difficult property to describe because it's so immaterial. They might say it was a really foundational or a really character building experience. It was not easy to go through, but it opened his eyes even more to stuff that this individual didn't realize mattered. And so he, instead of living his life um, traum- traumatized or depressed or anxious for the rest of his life, he becomes an even better person and expresses even more virtue into the world due to this suffering event, for example.
Yes, suffering can definitely be the primary force for good in a lot of people. Because as we spoke about at the beginning, most people will not wake up until suffering has been inflicted on them. Once suffering has been inflicted on them, they will start to question their life. They'll start to question what they're doing. What is the purpose of waking up every day to do their life? And doing life is a very vague term because everyone has a different life, different lifestyle, different personal reason for waking up every single day. And I thought it was interesting when you mentioned the Greek man who um, had his entire family killed in the war and then was provoked by the leader. I think that's interesting because he still wanted to live after that. Most people, if something so traumatic happens, they would not want to live anymore. They would simply wish that they would have died with the others because sometimes it can be so overwhelming the suffering that they wish to have died with those people. And that's something that a tremendous amount of philosophers talk about, especially the existentialists, which are among my favorite philosophers, as well as the romantics. A lot of the romantic novelists write quite a lot about that because suffering can be so overwhelming that it leads the person to have no meaning whatsoever. Because they could still have meaning to their life. They could still have meaning of, oh, they want to see this person or they want to do this in their life. But their suffering can become so overwhelming that that is all trumped by the feeling inside of them of the loss or the pain. And so this is something we see routinely, obviously, like I said, in the romantic novels of the 19th century. But many people have also turned that into a good and a beautiful thing of they go down that road of despair and nihilism and quite frankly death. They look death in its face. They look at the reaper or the skeleton as it's often characterized, and then they say, I'm not going to allow you to end my life yet. And so then they return from looking into the darkness, into the pit. They have transcended hell, so to speak. And they come back to life, living every single day. As I said earlier, like it's a miracle. Because once you accept death, and once you have come to terms with your death, and that all things will soon disappear, then you're able to live every single day and be in the moment. Because that's something that the modern world has tremendous trouble with is living every single day in the moment. We're always thinking about what we did wrong in the past or what we need to do in the future rather than simply living with today. And a bit of the biblical wisdom is the evils for today, paraphrasing obviously, the evils for today are enough. Do not worry about tomorrow. There's a lot in the world today. For me, it is almost 11 a.m. only. There is an entire day awaiting. And so I have no idea what will happen today. You still have a lot of time left today as well. A tremendous amount of things could happen, or nothing could happen. And we must continue on regardless of what happens, whether we die today or not, whatever it may be. We never know when we're going to die. We never know when our loved ones are going to die. And we do not know if we're going to have something tremendously good happen as well. So in the end, it is simply day by day, whether you are in the gulag, whether you are in a mansion, whether you are a university student or you're a billionaire. Every single person has to take it day by day if they want to bear their unique set of suffering and live their life to the fullest with the use of philosophy. So I think that is a great way to close this discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Different people, regardless of their social situation and economic situation, they have different kinds of suffering. They usually say that when people go from poverty to wealth, they don't lose problems, their problems just change. And so if people are looking at wealthier people than them and thinking that they are always happy and they don't have any stress or anxiety or suffering, they're fooling themselves, because every single person has some form of suffering. We can be sure that the other person is always fighting a tough battle, and a good rule of thumb is they are fighting a tougher battle. So it gives us inspiration to be respectful with others, which will build meaningful relationships. And also, when we realize, even if just by reading a novel about suffering, that every single moment of our lives and every single day is a gift, it really does help us find meaning, I think, in our lives. And if connected to that meaning, we have a purpose in life. For example, my purpose in life is to try to find out as much as possible timeless wisdom and share it with the world. I think similarly to as what you have been done as well by your you sharing philosophical thoughts as well. And well, I think while we are living, assuming that this purpose that we found for our lives is really the purpose, and it will be the purpose until the end of our days. And no matter what kind of upheaval or turmoil or suffering in our lives happens, that this purpose remains until the end. And then if that is true, we can really say that this purpose that we have found, it can give meaning to our suffering, and we can say that this purpose is really a life purpose. And so it is basically the message that our lives live. And so I think it could be a good way to end this discussion. And I want to really thank you for being my guest today, Colin. And I hope you can, instead of wishing basically that your life be perfect, it would be unrealistic to do so. I, more than that, wish that you have the resilience and strength to deal with the challenges of your life. And I hope I also find that strength for the challenges in my life as well.
Definitely. Thanks for having me on, Rogerio. I really enjoyed our discussion, and I think that the viewers will find it very profitable to them and very beneficial for their journey in the philosophy.
And also, since Colin is here, I want to take the opportunity to mention that Colin is active on Twitter, and he also has a website called Philosophical Rambler, which I will link in the video description.
Thanks, Rogerio. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining, Colin, and thank you all for watching or listening.
Bye.
Bye.